Whispers echo through the sagas of the North, stories of Viking longships pushing beyond the edge of the known world, their dragon-headed prows cutting through fog and ice towards something that should not exist, an island, a place where men stood tall as trees, where the very ground trembled beneath footsteps that belonged to beings from another age. The Norse called them Jotnar, we might call them giants. But what the Vikings found on that distant shore was far stranger than any myth prepared them for. In the cold waters west of Iceland, somewhere between legend and the unforgiving Atlantic, there existed a place the old chronicles barely whisper about, a land the Vikings stumbled upon during the height of their expansion, when their ships ranged from Constantinople to the shores of North America. But this island, this particular discovery, never made it into the histories we learned in school. It was buried, hidden in fragments of sagas that scholars dismissed as fantasy, yet the details, when you dig into them, refuse to fade away like simple stories should. The year was somewhere around 985. 3 Viking ships had set out from Greenland's eastern settlement, captained by a man named Bjorn Herjolfsson. Though some versions of the tale call him by other names, they were searching for new hunting grounds, new lands to claim, following rumors that drifted back from ships that had gone west and returned with strange tales. The crews were experienced. These weren't merchants or farmers playing at exploration. These were men who'd sailed through pack ice and survived storms that could snap a mast like kindling. They knew the difference between a seal colony on a distant rock and something that didn't belong in their world. What they found started with the birds, massive seabirds, larger than any they'd seen before, circling high above water, that had turned an unusual shade of green. The color alone should have warned them, but Vikings didn't turn back from strange waters. They pushed forward, and as the fog began to thin, they saw cliffs rising from the ocean, black stone that climbed higher than seemed natural. The island appeared suddenly, the way land sometimes does when mist parts, but there was something about its size, its scale, that made even these hardened sailors pause at their oars. They landed on a beach of black sand. The volcanic rock crunched beneath their boots, and immediately they noticed the silence. No birds called from the cliffs, despite the hundreds they'd seen circling offshore. No sound of waves, though the ocean was right there behind them. Just a stillness that pressed against their ears like hands covering them. One of the men, a navigator named Orm, later wrote in a fragment of saga that still survives that the silence felt like being inside a burial mound. The air was thick, almost solid, though there was nothing to see that would make it so. They moved inland, following what appeared to be a path. But here's where the accounts begin to shift into something harder to dismiss as invention. The path was paved with stones. Flat, perfectly fitted stones that formed a road wide enough for 6 men to walk abreast. The Vikings knew Roman roads. They'd seen the old imperial highways in the south. This was similar but larger, much larger. The stones themselves were each the size of a sleeping man, fitted together without mortar and worn smooth by what must have been centuries of use. The road led them through a forest, and this is where multiple accounts from different sources begin to align in disturbing ways. The trees were pines, recognizable enough, but they grew to heights that dwarfed anything the Vikings knew from their northern homelands. The lowest branches started at least 30 feet above the ground. The trunks were broad as houses, and beneath them, scattered among the roots, they found things that made them stop their advance. Tools, or what had to be tools, because they had the shape of axes and hammers, but each one was larger than a man could lift. The axe head that Orm's saga describes would have required 6 men to carry, and its handle, rotted and broken where it lay, had been a tree trunk in itself. One of the crew wanted to turn back. The sagas name him as Thorstein, and they record his words with unusual precision. He said the island felt wrong. that they were trespassing in a place that belonged to something else. The Christian word he used translates roughly as defiled, but that doesn't quite capture the Norse concept he was reaching for. It was more like they'd stepped into a space that had been marked by powers that predated the gods his people knew. But Bjorn pushed them forward. 3 ships didn't sail this far to turn back because of old axes. They found the first dwelling an hour later. It stood in a clearing where the massive trees had been cut down, their stumps still visible, each one broad enough to build a longhouse on. The structure was stone, fitted together in the same way as the road, without mortar but tight as any Roman architecture. It rose 4 stories high. The doorway was 20 feet tall, and inside, in the dim light that filtered through gaps in the ceiling, they found furniture. A chair, a table, the proportions were all wrong. The chair's seat was at chest height to a standing man. The table would have required a ladder to set dishes on its surface, but these weren't ancient ruins. This is the detail that appears in every fragment of the tale that survives. The dwelling was maintained clean. There was no dust, no debris, no signs of abandonment. A fire pit in the center of the room held ashes that were still warm. The Vikings touched them and pulled their hands back, uncertain whether to be relieved or terrified that they'd missed the occupant by mere hours. They found more, 9 buildings in total, arranged around a central plaza that could have held every longhouse in Iceland, with room to spare. Each structure showed signs of recent use. Tools lay beside doorways, proportioned for hands 3 times the size of a normal man's. Cooking vessels large enough to serve as bathing tubs, and bones. Animal bones picked clean from creatures the Vikings recognized. Seals, walrus, but also bones they couldn't identify. Massive ribs and skulls that suggested prey as large as whales, but with the wrong shape, the wrong structure. The account from Orm's saga includes a detail that modern scholars have tried to explain away as symbolic or mistranslated, but the description is too specific for that. He says they found a staff leaning against one of the dwellings. It was carved from a single piece of wood, dark and heavy, marked with runes that he recognized as Norse, but couldn't read, as if they were in an older dialect his education hadn't covered. The staff stood 15 feet tall, and when Orm tried to lift it just to test its weight, he found it was heavier than an anchor. Not heavy for its size, he wrote, but heavy in a way that seemed to defy the thickness of the wood itself, as if the air around it pressed down with extra force. They took nothing. This detail appears in multiple sources, and it's unusual enough to be noteworthy. Vikings were practical people. They took what they could use, claimed what they could hold, but from this island, they carried away only their observations and a dread that followed them back to their ships. Bjorn ordered them to move quickly, to put distance between themselves and the settlement before nightfall, because nightfall was coming, and none of them wanted to be on that island when darkness arrived. As they reached the black sand beach where they'd landed, one of the crew spotted something offshore. Ships, not longships, but vessels that made their own craft look like children's toys. The hulls were enormous, built on a scale that suggested crews of 50 or more, and they moved with impossible speed despite having no visible oars or sail. The details here are frustratingly vague. The sagas say they looked like floating fortresses, black against the darkening water, and they were heading toward the island. The Vikings didn't wait to see who commanded those ships. They launched their boats, 3 crews rowing with a desperation that surprised even themselves, and they didn't look back until the island was lost behind the curve of the horizon. That night, camped on an ice floe 40 miles east, they argued about what they'd seen. Some wanted to return with more men, with weapons, prepared for whatever they might face. Others insisted the island should be left alone, that some things existed outside the reach of human ambition. Bjorn, according to the account, said nothing. He sat by the fire and stared west toward where they'd been, and in the morning he gave the order to sail for home. They reached Greenland 3 weeks later. Bjorn reported the discovery to the settlement's leaders, and here the story takes a turn that historians have debated for centuries. The official response was to forbid any return expedition, not because they doubted the tale, the sagas are clear on this point, but because they believed it. The island was declared off limits by order of the settlement's council. Ships were warned away from those waters, and within a generation, the location of the island had been deliberately lost. The navigational details weren't passed down. The landmarks weren't recorded. It was erased from the mental maps that Viking sailors carried in their heads. But the story didn't disappear. It survived in fragments, whispered versions that slipped into other sagas, as brief mentions. A footnote in one chronicle about Bjorn Herjolfsson's travels mentions an island of the old ones. Another text, a manuscript from Iceland, dated to the 1200s, includes a warning to sailors about waters west of Greenland, where the measurements of things cannot be trusted. A third source, a letter from a monk who'd interviewed aged Vikings in their final years, records a tale about giants who built in stone and sailed ships that moved without wind. The academic consensus, for what it's worth, is that these are all referring to either Native American settlements encountered during Viking expeditions to North America or to misidentified natural formations seen under conditions of poor visibility and heightened fear. The explanations are reasonable. They account for most of the details, but they don't quite account for all of them. The consistent measurements, for instance. 3 separate sources give similar proportions for the structures and tools. Doorways at 20 feet, tables at chest height to a standing man. These aren't the vague giant of legend. They're specific, as if the witnesses were trying to document something real. The runes on the staff. Orm's description notes they were recognizable but archaic. That suggests not invention, but an encounter with an older form of written Norse that had survived somewhere beyond the reach of the settlements. But where? And maintained by whom? The ships seen offshore. This detail appears only in Orm's saga fragment, but it's described with a precision that doesn't match how mythical elements usually appear in these texts. He gives their color, their speed, their lack of visible means of propulsion. He estimates their size based on comparison to known vessels. These aren't the narrative flourishes of a storyteller. They're the observations of someone trying to report what he genuinely saw. What makes this all more intriguing is what happened later. In the years following Bjorn's expedition, several other Viking voyages went missing in the waters west of Greenland. Ships that simply never returned. The official records blame storms, ice, the normal hazards of North Atlantic sailing. But there are hints in marginalized texts that some of those ships were deliberately seeking the giant's island. Men who'd heard the stories, who didn't believe in leaving mystery unexplored, who thought they could succeed where Bjorn had only observed and fled. None of them made it back, and after a decade of losses, the Norwegian crown issued an edict that's still preserved in Oslo's archives. It forbade any expeditions to lands west of Greenland's western settlement without royal permission. The punishment for violation was outlawry, effectively a death sentence. The edict doesn't explain why. It simply states the prohibition and promises severe consequences. But its timing, coming exactly 10 years after the last recorded expedition to seek the island, is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The Norse weren't the first to tell stories of giants in the North Atlantic. Celtic sailors had legends of Fomorians, massive beings who lived on islands beyond the edge of the known world. The Irish spoke of the Tuatha De Danann, a race of superhuman people who supposedly fled Ireland for mysterious lands in the west. These stories predate Viking expansion by centuries. They suggest a much older tradition of encounters with something in those waters. Even the name Jotnar, the Norse word for giants, carries implications that scholars tend to overlook. In the oldest texts, Jotnar aren't just big people, they're described as the elder race, beings who existed before the gods, who built the bones of the world. The myths position them as primal forces rather than simple monsters, and crucially, they're consistently associated with wild places, with frontiers beyond human civilization. It's almost as if the concept evolved as a way to describe something real that defied easier explanation. There's a map. Not many people know about it because it's locked in a private collection in Denmark, but photographs exist for researchers. It's a vellum chart dated to approximately 1050, less than a century after Bjorn's voyage. The map shows Greenland, Iceland, parts of Norway, and west of Greenland, there's an island marked with a skull symbol and a notation in Latin that translates roughly as where the tall men walk. The island's position on the map corresponds to no known landmass. Modern oceanographic surveys have found nothing in those coordinates but deep water. Yet the map exists. Someone thought it was important enough to record. What happened to the giants? If they existed, if the Vikings truly found their settlement, where did they go? The accounts offer no answers, only the sense that Bjorn and his crew had stumbled into something much older than themselves, something that had its own purposes and its own claims to those waters. The fact that the settlement showed signs of recent use suggests the giants, if that's what they were, hadn't vanished into history. They were contemporary with the Vikings, they were there at the same time, but there's another possibility that emerges when you look at all the fragments together. The giants might not have been the original inhabitants of that island. The architectural style, the careful stone fitting, the organized layout of the settlement, all of these suggest a long period of occupation and refinement. But the bones found in the refuse piles, the tools left lying about, these hint at something more temporary, as if the giants themselves were visitors, as if the island had belonged to something even older, and they were simply using what they'd found. This interpretation comes from a Danish scholar named Henrik Svensson, who spent 3 decades piecing together every scrap of saga, evidence about the giants' island before his death in 1998. His work was never published in mainstream journals. Too speculative, the academic reviewers said, but his notes, preserved in Copenhagen's Royal Library, lay out a compelling case. He argues that the island was a way station, a stop on a route between somewhere far to the west and the European Arctic. The giants were travelers, and the Vikings had simply caught them during one of their periodic visits. Svensson's theory would explain why the settlement looked maintained but not actively occupied, why there were signs of recent use but no actual inhabitants when the Vikings explored. The giants came and went. They had their own cycle, their own schedule, and the massive ships seen offshore were arriving to pick up whatever group had been stationed there to continue their journey to wherever they were ultimately heading. It sounds like fantasy, but Svensson backed it up with linguistic analysis that's difficult to ignore. He traced the runes Orm described on the staff, matching them to Proto-Norse inscriptions found in Scandinavia that predate the Viking Age by several centuries. If his translations are correct, the staff was marked with navigational information, not poetry, not magic, but practical directions for sailing between specific points. The coordinates he extracted from the runes point to locations in the North Atlantic that would have been impossible for Vikings to reach, but might have been accessible to someone with better ships and better knowledge of ice navigation. When Svensson died, he was trying to organize an expedition. He'd found funding, assembled a team, obtained permission to use deep water submersibles to search the area where the island should have been. But 2 weeks before the planned departure, the funding was mysteriously withdrawn. The Danish government, which had initially approved the expedition, suddenly revoked its support, and Svensson suffered a stroke that left him unable to continue. His team dispersed, the submersibles were reassigned to other projects, and the expedition never happened. His daughter, Astrid Svensson, still lives in Copenhagen. She's continued her father's research in a limited way, working with the fragments he left behind. In an interview 5 years ago, she mentioned something that didn't make it into the published article. She said her father had received a visit from two men a week before the funding collapsed. They claimed to be from the Norwegian Directorate of Cultural Heritage, conducting a routine review of historical research projects. They asked detailed questions about what he hoped to find, what exactly he was looking for in those waters, and then they left. The next day, the funding was canceled. Astrid was careful not to claim conspiracy. She acknowledged her father's age, the stress of organizing such an ambitious expedition, the possibility that his health had simply failed at an inconvenient time. But she also said something that stayed with the interviewer. She said her father had been scared after that visit. Not worried, not concerned, scared. And Henrik Svensson had spent 30 years studying violent sagas and cataloging ancient horrors without losing sleep. Whatever those men had asked him, whatever implications their questions carried, it had shaken someone who didn't shake easily. The Giant's Island, if it existed, is gone now. Either it sank, which is an impossible given volcanic activity in the North Atlantic, or it was never where we think it was, and the Vikings' navigational records were more corrupted by time than we realize, or it's still there, hidden by more than just fog and distance. The Norse deliberately forgot its location. Maybe there was a reason for that. Maybe some discoveries are meant to stay buried. But the question remains, what did Bjorn and his crew actually see? The skeptical explanation is that they encountered Inuit settlements, or possibly Norse colonists who'd grown isolated and strange in their habits. And the details got exaggerated through retellings until ordinary men became giants. This is tidy. It fits within our understanding of how legends develop. Yet it doesn't explain everything. The architectural sophistication, for instance, the Inuit of that period built with available materials, primarily skins and bone and sod. Stone architecture existed, yes, but not on the scale described. Not with the precision of fitted blocks and multi-story structures. The Norse themselves, when they settled Greenland, built simpler structures than what Orm's saga describes. So who taught whom and when? There's also the problem of the ships. Vikings knew ships better than almost anything else in their world. They could identify a vessel's origin by the shape of its prow, estimate its crew size from its length, judge its cargo capacity at a glance. When Orm says the offshore ships were unlike anything they knew, were larger than should be possible, moved without visible means, that's not poetic license. That's a shipwright documenting something that violated his understanding of how boats worked. Some researchers have suggested the Vikings encountered a Chinese exploration fleet. There's a fringe theory that Chinese ships reached American waters decades before Columbus, but Chinese vessels, while large, weren't constructed with the same proportions the sagas describe. And Chinese sailors weren't 15 feet tall. The theory solves one mystery by creating several others. What about the tools? The massive axes and hammers left lying among the tree roots. These are harder to explain away. Tools have purposes, they're made to specific sizes for specific hands. An axe head that requires 6 men to lift isn't a symbol or a monument. It's not serving any practical function if the people using it are human-sized. It only makes sense if the users matched its scale, unless they were used differently. Some archaeologists have proposed that what the Vikings saw were industrial tools, meant to be operated by crews or moved with mechanical advantage rather than raw strength. This would explain the size without requiring giant operators. But then you have to explain why such sophisticated engineering would have been present in the North Atlantic in the late 10th century, where no culture we know of had developed it yet. The answer that explains the most details is the one nobody wants to say out loud. That Bjorn's crew saw exactly what they reported. A settlement built and occupied by beings significantly larger than humans. That such beings existed, were intelligent, were capable of ocean travel, and were operating in the North Atlantic at the same time Vikings were expanding their reach. This explanation requires accepting that there are gaps in our understanding of who lived in these waters 1,000 years ago. It means admitting our maps are incomplete. Most historians won't go there, can't go there really, because accepting one fantastical element means potentially accepting others, and the whole structure of how we understand the past starts to crack. But the evidence sits there, in fragments across multiple archives, in consistent details that span generations of telling. Something happened in those waters west of Greenland, something that frightened people who weren't easily frightened, something important enough to be actively suppressed by both Norse authorities and, if Astrid Svensson's suspicions are correct, by modern governments who found references to it in their historical surveys. There's one more detail worth mentioning. It comes from a source so obscure that even dedicated researchers miss it. A tax record from Bergen, Norway, dated to 1023, includes an itemized list of goods confiscated from a trader accused of violating the crown's edict about Western expeditions. Among the items was what the record describes as Tooth of the Tall Men. It was measured at 14 inches long, white, and valued at 3 times the price of walrus ivory. The tooth was sent to the Bishop of Bergen as part of the crown's share of confiscated goods. There's no record of what happened to it after that. Church inventories from the period don't mention it. Either it was lost or someone decided it was better not to document its existence. But for a brief moment, there's a hard reference to physical evidence, something tangible, something that could be measured and valued and held in hand. 14 inches long. Human teeth don't grow anywhere near that size. Neither do the teeth of any land animal that could plausibly have been in the North Atlantic during the Viking Age. Walrus tusks get longer, but they're not called teeth in official records because everyone knew the difference. This was categorized as a tooth, and it was linked directly to the tall men through its label. Where is it now? If it survived, if it's sitting in some museum basement, cataloged under the wrong description, or locked in a private collection whose owner doesn't realize what they have, could modern science tell us anything? DNA analysis, isotope studies, structural examination, these tools could potentially reveal what species it came from, whether it was actually from something humanoid but scaled up, whether the stories have any basis in biology rather than pure legend. But finding one lost tooth in 1,000 years of accumulated artifacts is nearly impossible. And even if someone did find it, even if they tested it and got results that suggested something anomalous, would they publish? Or would they find, like Henrik Svensson did, that some research doesn't get completed, that some questions attract unwanted attention? The Giant's Island has become a ghost story among historians. The kind of thing mentioned in footnotes, if at all. The kind of mystery that serious scholars don't waste time on because there's no clear path to answers, but it won't quite go away. Every few years, someone new discovers the saga fragments. They read about Bjorn and Orm. They start asking questions, and usually, eventually, they're told that it's a dead end. That chasing Viking tales of giants is career suicide for anyone who wants to be taken seriously. So they move on to safer topics, more documentable subjects. Yet, the questions remain. Somewhere in the cold waters west of Greenland, there might be ruins on a seafloor. Stone structures too large for human use, fitted together without mortar, waiting in the dark where no light reaches and no expedition has searched. Or there might be nothing but rock and silt, and the whole story was exactly what the skeptics say. Exaggeration, built on misidentification, built on fear. But if Bjorn's crew saw what they claimed to see, if the giants were real, then they had to come from somewhere. They had to have a history, a culture, a reason for being in those waters. And if they existed in the 10th century, operating settlements and sailing ships and living their lives just beyond the edge of Viking knowledge, what happened to them? Did they die out? Did they leave? Or are they still there in places we haven't looked? Doing things we haven't imagined, living in the gaps our civilization hasn't yet filled. The Vikings found them once by accident by pushing their ships just a little too far into unknown waters. They found them and came back changed, frightened enough to erase their own navigational records and forbid any return. Maybe they knew something we've forgotten. Maybe they understood that some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. Some discoveries change everything. And maybe, just maybe, there are things in this world that are meant to remain beyond our reach, hidden, forgotten, but still there, still waiting, in the cold waters where the measurements of things cannot be trusted, where the tall men walk, where Viking longships found something that shouldn't exist but does, still does. The question is whether anyone will be brave enough or foolish enough to go looking again. Someone did, though the official records won't confirm it, though the expedition was buried under layers of bureaucratic denial and convenient accidents. Someone went looking in the winter of 2007. A private research team funded by an anonymous Norwegian foundation, equipped with side-scan sonar and deep-water submersibles, spent 6 weeks mapping the seafloor in a grid pattern west of Greenland. They were supposedly searching for Viking shipwrecks. That's what their permits said. That's what they told the Danish and Greenlandic authorities, who monitored their work. But one of the team members, a sonar operator named Marcus Lindholm, broke his silence 3 years ago. He was dying then. Cancer that had already spread too far for treatment. And he wanted to talk before the silence became permanent. What he described in a recorded interview, preserved now in a private archive in Stockholm, doesn't match the expedition's official findings. The public report said they found nothing. Lindholm said otherwise. They located it on day 17, a seamount that rose from the abyssal plain to within 200 feet of the surface, crowned with structures that sonar couldn't quite resolve. The images showed right angles where nature doesn't make right angles. They showed formations too regular to be volcanic, too organized to be random accumulations of fallen rock. The expedition leader, a marine archaeologist named Dr. Elin Nordstrom, made the decision to send down the submersible. Lindholm operated the cameras. He watched the feed as the sub descended through layers of darkening water, past the depth where sunlight reaches into the cold, permanent night of the deep ocean. The seamount's peak came into view slowly, first as a vague mass in the submersible's lights, then with increasing clarity as details emerged from shadow. He described walls, massive blocks of stone fitted together exactly as Orm's saga had described them, on the surface island 1,000 years before. Structures that had somehow survived whatever sinking or subsidence had dragged them beneath the waves. The sub's pilot maneuvered closer, following what appeared to be a street between buildings. The scale was wrong in exactly the way the Viking accounts had warned. Doorways that towered above the submersible. Windows positioned for eyes that would look down from heights no human could reach. And everywhere, that same architectural precision, that same sense of intentional construction by beings who understood engineering at a level that rivaled anything modern humans had achieved. But here's what made Lindholm break decades of silence, what haunted him through his final illness. The structures weren't empty, as the submersible's lights swept across one of the larger buildings. Its cameras caught movement inside one of those massive doorways. Something pale shifting in the darkness beyond the reach of illumination. Something that retreated when light touched it, pulling back into depths the cameras couldn't penetrate. Dr. Nordstrom ordered the pilot to hold position. For 11 minutes, according to Lindholm, they waited in the submersible's lights while something moved in that doorway. Not the random drift of sea life, not the sway of current-driven plants, movement that suggested intention, that implied observation. The thing, whatever it was watching them just as they were trying to watch it. Then the submersible's electrical systems began to fail. One by one, non-critical systems shut down. The sonar went first, then the recording equipment, then the external lights. Only the life support and the main motor remained functional, and those were fluctuating in ways that made the pilot nervous. Dr. Nordstrom made the call to surface immediately. The sub rose through the water faster than safety protocols recommended, the pilot pushing the motors to their limit while power levels continued to drop. They made it to the surface with 17% battery remaining. 30 seconds later, every electrical system in the submersible failed completely. They bobbed in the dark for 40 minutes, sealed in a metal cylinder that had become a tomb if rescue didn't reach them, before the support vessel located them and brought them aboard. When technicians examined the sub's systems later, they found no explanation for the power drain. The batteries were dead, yes, but they'd been fully charged at the start of the dive. Something had drawn off that energy at a rate that shouldn't have been possible. Dr. Nordstrom filed her report that evening. According to Lindholm, she documented everything: the structures, the scale, the movement in the doorway, the power failure. She recommended a return expedition with better equipment, more submersibles, multiple dives to map and document what they'd found. The report went to the expedition's sponsors, to the Norwegian Foundation that had funded the work. The response came 3 days later. The expedition was terminated immediately. All personnel were to return to port, seal their data and samples, and sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. The submersible's camera footage was confiscated. Dr. Nordstrom protested, argued that they'd made a discovery of immense historical and archaeological significance. She was told the expedition had found nothing of value, and future funding would depend on her cooperation with that conclusion. She cooperated. Most of them did. They signed the papers, took their compensation, and went back to their regular lives. Lindholm signed too, but he kept copies of some of the sonar images. Low quality, pulled from backup systems before the data was sealed, but clear enough to show what they'd mapped. He kept them hidden for 16 years, never showing them to anyone, never speaking about what he'd seen, until the cancer diagnosis made him reconsider what mattered. The images he released show formations that marine geologists have tried to explain as natural features. Volcanic intrusions shaped by millions of years of current erosion. The explanations are possible technically, but they require a very specific sequence of geological events that don't normally occur in that location. It's like explaining away a skyscraper by saying wind and water could theoretically carve rock into that shape given enough time. Technically true, functionally absurd. What happened to Dr. Nordstrom? She continued working in marine archaeology for another 8 years, publishing papers on Viking shipwrecks and medieval trade routes. Nothing about giants or underwater cities. Nothing about the expedition in 2007. Then, in 2015, she took an early retirement and moved to a remote island in the Lofoten archipelago. She's still there, still alive, but she doesn't give interviews. She doesn't respond to emails. The few journalists who've tried to visit her property have been turned away by security that seems excessive for a retired academic. Lindholm's interview, recorded by his daughter 3 months before his death, was shared privately among researchers interested in Viking mysteries. It's never been officially published. The journalist who was supposed to write the story dropped it after receiving what he described as very clear warnings that pursuing the topic would be harmful to his career. The recording exists in multiple copies now, circulated through academic back channels and collector communities, but it exists in a gray zone, acknowledged but not quite credible, documented but not quite provable. This is how modern suppression works, not through dramatic censorship or violent intimidation, but through the quiet denial of funding, the strategic loss of data, the careful destruction of careers for anyone who pushes too hard against approved narratives. The Giant's Island, or its sunken remains, might be real. The evidence suggests something unusual exists in those waters. But the system has decided it's not a discovery we're ready to acknowledge. Why? That's the question that nags at anyone who digs into this story. What's the threat in admitting that large humanoid beings lived in the North Atlantic, that they built sophisticated structures and sailed advanced ships? It would rewrite some history, certainly. It would complicate our understanding of human development and expansion. But it wouldn't destroy civilization. It wouldn't break the world. Unless there's more to the story. Unless the giants weren't just historical curiosities, but something that has implications for the present. Lindholm, in his final interview, mentioned something that Dr. Nordstrom had said during the expedition. After the submersible surfaced, after they'd caught their breath and begun to process what they'd encountered, she'd made an offhand comment. She said the structures looked maintained, not ruined, not abandoned to the sea for a millennium, maintained. That detail didn't make it into her official report. But Lindholm remembered it clearly. The stone blocks had been clean of the marine growth that should have covered them after 1,000 years underwater. The doorways showed no sign of collapse or decay. Everything they'd seen looked as if it had been built recently, or at least as if someone was actively preventing deterioration, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the island didn't sink. Maybe it was moved, deliberately submerged, to hide it from increasingly efficient human surveillance and exploration technology. Maybe the giants, or whoever maintained those structures, decided that the surface of the ocean was becoming too crowded, too observed, and they retreated to depths where human civilization rarely ventures. And maybe what the submersible's cameras caught in that doorway wasn't a remnant or a ghost. Maybe it was a current resident, still living in those underwater halls, still walking those submerged streets, still there. This interpretation aligns with something else that Lindholm mentioned, the power drain. Submersibles lose power for various reasons, but the pattern he described suggested something drawing energy actively, rather than a mechanical failure, as if the batteries were being drained by external influence, as if something in those ruins had the capability and the intent to disable the intruding technology. There's a theory in fringe archaeological circles that advanced civilizations leave signatures in the geological record, not just ruins and artifacts, but subtle manipulations of natural systems that persist long after the civilization itself has vanished. Anomalous magnetic fields, unusual isotope distributions in sediment, patterns in ocean currents that shouldn't exist based on known geography. If the giants were technologically sophisticated, if they'd been operating in the North Atlantic for centuries or longer, they might have left such signatures. A graduate student at the University of Bergen, working on her doctoral thesis about medieval Norse trade routes, stumbled across something interesting in 2018. She was analyzing magnetic survey data from the Greenland Sea, looking for shipwreck sites, when she noticed an anomaly, a point source of unusual magnetic activity, its coordinates that matched, within the margin of error, The location, Lindholm's sonar data, suggested for the underwater structures. The anomaly was subtle, easily dismissed as equipment noise or a localized mineral deposit. But it pulsed, regular intervals, roughly 12 hours apart, a slight intensification of the magnetic field, followed by a return to baseline. Natural magnetism doesn't pulse like that. It's stable, or it fluctuates randomly based on solar activity and geological movement. Deliberate pulses suggest something generating the field intentionally. The student included a mention of the anomaly in her thesis, noting it as an unexplained observation that warranted further investigation. Her doctoral committee asked her to remove it. The anomaly wasn't relevant to her thesis topic, they said. It was speculative and potentially distracting. She argued briefly, then acquiesced, and submitted a revised version without the magnetic data. She received her doctorate. She now works for a petroleum company mapping offshore oil deposits, a job that keeps her far from historical research and underwater archaeology. But the magnetic data exists. It's archived with the Norwegian Geological Survey, available to anyone who knows where to look and what questions to ask. The pulses continue. Every 12 hours, that point in the Greenland Sea shows a brief magnetic intensification. Something down there is active. Something is operating on a regular cycle, and based on the coordinates, that something is located directly above the seamount where Dr. Nordstrom's expedition found structures they were told to forget. This is where evidence and speculation blur together uncomfortably. The hard facts are sparse. Viking sagas mention an island of giants with specific details about architecture and scale. A 20th century researcher spent decades compiling references and died before completing his expedition. A 21st century exploration team found underwater structures that matched the descriptions and were immediately shut down. And there's an ongoing magnetic anomaly at the same location. These are the pieces that can be verified, at least partially. Everything else is interpretation. But interpretation matters when you're trying to understand what might be real. And the pattern that emerges when you lay all the pieces together suggests that something large and organized has been operating in the North Atlantic for at least 1,000 years. Something that builds in stone, that travels by sea, that prefers to remain hidden from human observation. Something that has the resources or the authority or the capability to ensure that human expeditions don't succeed in documenting its existence. The Norse encountered it first, or at least they're the first to leave written records of the encounter. They responded with a mixture of fear and respect, forbidding return expeditions and deliberately losing the navigational information that would have allowed rediscovery. They understood, apparently, that some neighbors are better left unvisited, that some boundaries shouldn't be crossed. Modern civilization, confident in its technology and its understanding of the world, has been less cautious. We've sent expeditions to every corner of the globe, mapped every square mile of the ocean floor, cataloged every species we can find. We don't like mysteries. We don't respect boundaries we didn't set ourselves. So we keep probing, keep investigating, keep trying to document what the Vikings decided to forget, and we keep being turned back. Not through violence, though. The submersible's power failure suggests the capability for that, if needed, but through more subtle means, through the quiet withdrawal of funding, through the strategic loss of data, through career pressures that make researchers choose between their curiosity and their livelihoods, through a system of soft suppression that's more effective than any heavy-handed censorship could be. Who's doing the suppressing? That's the question that conspiracy theorists love and serious researchers avoid. The easy answer is government agencies worried about public panic or diplomatic complications, maybe the giants, if they're still active, have made contact with certain authorities, maybe There are agreements in place, treaties we don't know about, understandings that require keeping their existence secret. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe the suppression is structural rather than coordinated. Maybe every institution that encounters evidence of something that shouldn't exist responds the same way, independently, because acknowledging that evidence would require too many other admissions, would require saying we were wrong about history, wrong about who shares this planet, wrong about the level of sophistication possible in pre-modern societies. And institutions don't like being wrong. They'll work very hard to avoid that admission. Either way, the result is the same. The giant's island remains hidden, the evidence remains fragmentary, and anyone who tries to dig too deep finds themselves discouraged through means that are difficult to prove but impossible to ignore. But here's what they can't suppress. The stories themselves, the sagas, survive, copied and recopied over centuries by scribes who didn't always understand what they were preserving, but recognized the importance of maintaining the record. The accounts of Bjorn and Orm and the other Vikings who saw something that changed them persist in archives across Scandinavia. They can be read by anyone with access to a research library, or increasingly through digitized collections available online. The evidence is scattered, yes. It requires piecing together fragments from multiple sources, comparing accounts that were never meant to be read together, accepting that truth sometimes wears the disguise of legend. But it's there. The giants existed. They left traces, and those traces remain visible for anyone willing to look carefully enough. What were they? The biological question matters, even if we can't answer it definitively without physical specimens to study. The descriptions from Norse sources are consistent enough to sketch a basic profile. Humanoid in form, suggesting similar evolutionary pressures to those that shaped our own species. Bipedal, tool-using, clearly intelligent based on their architectural achievements, but scaled up significantly, roughly doubling human height and presumably quadrupling mass based on the square-cube law of biology. That size presents challenges. Larger animals require more food, more oxygen, stronger skeletal structures to support their weight. A 15-foot humanoid would need adaptations that humans lack, denser bones perhaps, or a more efficient metabolism. The fact that they apparently thrived in the harsh North Atlantic environment suggests they were either incredibly hardy, or they had technology that compensated for biological limitations. The ships described in the sagas offer a clue. Vessels that moved without visible means of propulsion, that traveled faster than Viking longships despite being much larger. This isn't magic. It suggests an understanding of hydrodynamics and possibly mechanical power that exceeded anything available to medieval Europeans. If the giants had developed such technology, they might have had other innovations that made their size less of a biological burden. Climate control for their dwellings, efficient food preservation, medical knowledge that extended lifespans or improved health. We tend to assume that technological development follows a single path, that civilization must progress through specific stages in a predetermined order. But that's anthropocentric thinking. A different species, with different environmental pressures and different biological capabilities, might develop technology along entirely different lines. The giants might have had advanced engineering without ever inventing writing, or sophisticated navigation without developing agriculture. Their civilization might be completely recognizable in its basics, people living together, building structures, traveling, but completely alien in its specifics. Or they might not be from Earth at all. This is where the speculation gets truly wild. But it's worth mentioning because some researchers have gone there. If beings of that size couldn't evolve under Earth's gravity and atmosphere, if the biological challenges are simply too great, then maybe they came from somewhere else. Somewhere with different conditions, that would support larger body plans. And maybe they've been visiting Earth or using it as an outpost for far longer than human civilization has existed. The underwater city would make sense in that context. A base in an environment we rarely visit, maintained over centuries or millennia, serving purposes we can't guess at. The periodic returns mentioned in the sagas, the sense that the island was a way station rather than a permanent home, would fit with a visiting population rather than a native one. But this stretches credulity too far for most people. Giants from another world, maintaining secret bases in our oceans. It sounds like science fiction. It sounds absurd. Yet the alternative is accepting that a species of large humanoids evolved on Earth, developed sophisticated technology, built civilizations, and somehow left almost no trace in the archaeological record beyond a few Viking accounts and some suspicious underwater formations. Both explanations are difficult. Neither fits comfortably within our understanding of how the world works. And that's precisely why the evidence gets suppressed, why the research gets discouraged. Because this isn't a mystery with an easy answer. It's a mystery that, no matter how you solve it, requires admitting we don't know as much as we thought we did. The Vikings understood this. They encountered the giants, witnessed their works, and made the conscious decision to step back, to forbid further exploration, to erase the maps. They weren't primitive or superstitious in doing this. They were being pragmatic. They recognized that they'd found something beyond their ability to comprehend or control, and they chose caution over curiosity. We could learn from that. Modern civilization, with all its technology and all its confidence, might benefit from recognizing that there are still things in this world that operate on their own terms, things that don't require our understanding or our approval to exist, things that might be better left alone. But we won't, of course. We'll keep probing, keep investigating, keep sending submersibles and sonar and satellites to map every corner of the planet. Eventually, someone will get lucky, or persistent enough to bring back proof that can't be suppressed. A clear photograph, a video, maybe even physical samples. And then the conversation will change. Then we'll have to acknowledge what the Vikings knew 1,000 years ago. That we're not alone on this planet, that we never were, that in the cold waters beyond our usual reach, in the depths where light fails and pressure crushes, there are neighbors who've been here longer than us, who built their cities before ours, who sail their ships through waters we're only beginning to explore, who've watched us grow from scattered tribes to global civilization, all while maintaining their own existence separate from ours. The giants are still there, whether they're the descendants of the beings Bjorn saw, or whether there's something else entirely, something that's learned to hide even better. As our search technologies improved, the evidence suggests ongoing presence rather than ancient extinction. The maintained structures, the magnetic pulses, the power drain on the submersible, these aren't relics. These are signs of active occupation. And if they're still there, still active, still maintaining their underwater hulls and sailing their impossible ships, then the question becomes, what are they waiting for? Why the secrecy? Why the isolation? What purpose does it serve to remain hidden while human civilization sprawls across the surface world? Maybe they're waiting for us to mature, to develop enough wisdom to match our technology, to become the kind of species that can be trusted with the knowledge that we're not the dominant form of intelligence on this planet. Maybe they've watched countless civilizations rise and fall, and they're waiting to see if we'll be different, if we'll survive our own adolescence as a species. Or maybe they're not waiting at all. Maybe they simply don't care about us one way or another. We're surface dwellers. We're land creatures who occasionally venture onto the ocean but never truly inhabit it. Their world and ours overlap only at the margins. They go about their business in the depths, and we go about ours on dry land, and most of the time we never encounter each other. The Vikings got unlucky, stumbling into one of their settlements during a period of unusual proximity. Dr. Nordstrom's expedition got unlucky, mapping the seafloor in exactly the wrong spot. But luck runs both ways, and as human technology improves, as our submarines go deeper and our sensors grow more sensitive, the chances of another encounter increase. Eventually, the luck will run out completely. Eventually, we'll find something we can't ignore, or suppress, or explain away, and then the world will have to adjust to a truth that's been hiding in plain sight for longer than we've had the wisdom to understand it. The Vikings tried to warn us. They wrote it down in their sagas, preserved the story through generations of retelling, maintained the memory, even as they deliberately lost the specific details. They left us a message. There are giants in the North Atlantic. There are beings who build in stone and sail impossible ships. There are neighbors who prefer their privacy. Respect that. Leave them alone. We didn't listen. We never listen to warnings when there's mystery to be solved and glory to be claimed. So we'll keep pushing, keep exploring, keep refusing to accept that some boundaries exist for good reasons, and eventually, one way or another, we'll get our answer. The question is whether we'll like what we find, whether the giants will welcome our discovery of them, or whether they'll respond the way they've responded before, by moving deeper, hiding better, ensuring that the next millennium passes without human intrusion into their world. They've managed it for 1,000 years, since Bjorn's voyage. They might manage it for 1,000 more, or they might decide the time for hiding has passed. That human civilization has grown too intrusive, too capable, too numerous to avoid any longer. That contact is inevitable and might as well happen on their terms rather than ours. If that day comes, if the giants choose to reveal themselves, the world will change in ways we can't predict. Until then, they remain what they've always been, a mystery at the edge of our knowledge, a presence in waters we rarely travel, a reminder that this planet holds secrets we haven't uncovered, intelligences we haven't met, civilizations that have been here all along, patiently waiting in the cold and the dark while we fumble our way toward understanding. The Vikings found them once. We found them again, briefly, incompletely, before the evidence was buried, and the witnesses were silenced. Someone will find them again, maybe in our lifetimes, maybe not for generations. But the giants are still there, still walking their underwater halls, still maintaining their impossible cities, still sailing their ships through depths we haven't mapped and waters we don't control, still waiting, still watching, still there. And now you know the story the Vikings tried to preserve and modern authorities try to suppress. You know about Bjorn and Orm, about Dr. Nordstrom and Marcus Lindholm, about the island that sank and the structures that remain. You know about the 14-inch tooth and the magnetic pulses and the unexplained power drain. You know that something exists in the North Atlantic that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of history and biology and civilization. You know the giants are real. Whether you choose to believe it is up to you. Whether you choose to investigate further, to dig into the archives, and search for the fragments of evidence that still survive, that's your decision. But understand that if you do, if you push too hard against this particular mystery, you might find yourself facing the same quiet resistance that stopped others. The lost funding, the missing data, the subtle pressure that makes continued research impossible. Some knowledge comes with a cost. Some truths are protected by systems that don't want them revealed. The giants are one of those truths. They've survived in shadow for 1,000 years because people with power and resources have decided that's where they should stay. That decision might be right, it might be wrong, but it's real, and it's enforced with surprising efficiency. So now you have a choice. You can dismiss this as an entertaining story, a collection of Viking myths and modern conspiracy theories woven together into something compelling but ultimately fictional. That's the safe choice. That's the path that leads back to normal life without complications. Or you can accept that there might be truth here, that the evidence, fragmentary and suppressed though it is, points to something real, that somewhere in the cold waters west of Greenland, at depths where light dies and pressure kills, there are structures built by hands larger than human. There are beings who've been here longer than us, who've watched our species rise from nothing to dominance while they remained hidden in the places we don't go. And if you accept that, if you let that truth settle into your understanding of the world, then nothing looks quite the same anymore. The ocean isn't just deep water and marine life. It's a frontier we haven't truly explored, a realm where other intelligences might operate without our knowledge or consent. History isn't a settled narrative with all the major players accounted for. It's incomplete, full of gaps where other stories might hide. The Vikings knew, they saw, they understood that the world was bigger and stranger than their maps suggested. They chose to preserve the memory while losing the specifics, keeping the warning alive while making the actual discovery difficult to repeat. Maybe they were wiser than us. Maybe they understood that some knowledge is dangerous, that some neighbors are better left undisturbed. But their warning has faded. Their caution has been forgotten, and now we're pushing into those same waters with technology they couldn't imagine, confident that we can handle whatever we find. Confident that discovery is always good, that knowledge is always worth pursuing, that the truth will somehow set us free. Maybe it will. Maybe when we finally force the giants out of hiding, when we bring back proof that can't be denied or suppressed, humanity will rise to the occasion. We'll make contact peacefully. We'll establish dialogue with a civilization that's been here all along. We'll expand our understanding of who we are and what we share this world with. Or maybe we'll repeat the pattern we've followed throughout our history. We'll respond with fear and aggression. We'll see the giants as a threat to be neutralized rather than neighbors to be respected. We'll take what the Vikings wisely left alone and turn it into another resource to exploit, another mystery to conquer, another wild thing to domesticate or destroy. The choice hasn't been made yet. The future isn't written, but the giants are still there, waiting in the depths, and sooner or later, we'll find them again. When that day comes, when we finally drag the truth into the light, and the world has to acknowledge what's been hiding beneath the waves, we'll discover whether humanity has grown wise enough to deserve the knowledge we've pursued so recklessly. Until then, the story remains. The Vikings saw giants. They found an island of stone structures built for beings twice human height. They witnessed ships that moved without wind and tools too large for human hands. They came back changed, frightened, and determined to forget. But they couldn't completely forget. The memory survived in fragments, in sagas that scholars dismissed and researchers ignored and authorities suppressed. But the memory survived, and now it's yours. The story of the giants, the island, the underwater city, the ongoing mystery that refuses to die. You carry it now. What you do with it is up to you, whether you share it or hide it, believe it or dismiss it, investigate it or ignore it. That's your choice to make. Just remember, if you do, choose to dig deeper. If you decide to look for the truth behind the myth, that others have walked that path before you. Some came back empty-handed, some came back changed, and some didn't come back at all. The giants guard their secrets well, and they've had 1,000 years to perfect the art of remaining hidden. The cold waters west of Greenland still hold their mysteries. The deep ocean still keeps its secrets, and somewhere in that darkness, in halls built of stone and maintained through centuries, the tall men still walk, Still wait, still watch, still there, and now you know.